It's a great pleasure to see so many of you here today and know that there are other folks in the overflow area to hear Sir Michael Leigh's remarks today. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce him to you. When I was doing a book on EU enlargement many years ago, I showed up in his office and I discovered he had a PhD in political science from MIT, and I figured that's probably the only reason he agreed to speak with me. But I interviewed him a couple of times about the process of EU enlargement. He was at the time Director General for that massive undertaking by the European Union, which resulted in 10 new member states between 2004 and 2007. He later became Director General for enlargement and concluded a approximately 30-year career in the European Commission, so part of the executive part of the European Union. A national of the United Kingdom, he had been educated before MIT at Oxford University, and later in 2012 was given a knighthood for his service to the UK in the European arena. I haven't talked to him about whether the country will ask for that back if it leaves the EU. I'm not sure what the rules are on that. Sir Michael Leigh is a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund, mostly in Brussels, although GMF has a global footprint, and he often works in the Washington, D.C. office. We're delighted that he's come out for the second time. He indeed came 2 years ago and spoke in this room and warned us about how serious the Brexit threat was. And Professor Heather Johnston and I wanted to have him back under the European Studies auspices now that the negotiations to leave are in shape, and to get a broader perspective on where the EU might be going in the next decade or so, and indeed where the UK is going in the next couple of years. So without further ado, I'd like to ask you to join me in giving a warm welcome to Sir Michael Leigh.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. Thank you, Kirk, Wade, Heather, for this opportunity. I'm delighted to be back here after 2 years, and having met many students over the last couple of days, I'm again extremely impressed with the level of interest and understanding of what is taking place in Europe today. You obviously have an excellent program and very focused on some of these issues. Also, I've been impressed by the language skills of students that I've met who really, through their missionary work or other work, have come to terms with a range of European cultures and know the countries very well. I'm going to aim to speak this afternoon for about 20 minutes and to share some thoughts with you, after which I'll be open to a Q&A session on any issues that you would like to raise, either covered in my introduction or other related or unrelated issues that you would like to mention. So I'm going to focus on the EU today. I have put a rather provocative title, but one which arises from the situation in Europe today, whether the EU will survive beyond the next decade. Astonishing that this question can be posed today. But let's look at that in a little bit more detail. And let's look also at different scenarios as to how Brexit might work out in practice. The European Union is widely considered to be one of the great peace projects of modern times. In 2012, the EU was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and the citation that year recognized that for over 6 decades, the EU contributed to the advancement of peace and reconciliation, democracy, and human rights in Europe. So I think the EU and its predecessors, the European Coal and Steel Community, the European Economic Community, played a key role, particularly after the Second World War, in reconciling the countries that had previously been at war, countries that had been occupied, in particular Franco-German reconciliation, but beyond that, really bringing peace to the continent. As Wade mentioned, the original 6 countries eventually enlarged. I was in charge of this process for a number of years, so that we ended up today with 28 member states who joined through 7 rounds of enlargement. So the EU exercised a kind of magnetic appeal to European countries and took on a succession of new member states either which had overthrown authoritarian rule, like Greece, Spain, and Portugal in the 80s, or following the collapse of communism, countries that wanted to rejoin Europe and to strengthen democracy. Enlargement has been the leitmotif of my own career and my interest for many, many years, and I do remain convinced, despite certain recent developments, that the enlargement of the EU and of NATO has contributed to stability, security, and increasing prosperity in Europe, notwithstanding the fact that the ride has been rather bumpy at times. I think we only have to try and imagine where Bulgaria and Romania would be today if they had not joined the EU and NATO. The same applies very much to the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, and others. If we are concerned about some developments in those countries, some backsliding from the high standards that the EU sets in terms of human rights and rule of law and democracy, nonetheless, I think it's clear that had they not joined the EU and NATO, their situation would be more akin perhaps to Ukraine than the one that they're able to enjoy today. The United States has generally strongly supported the process of European integration, despite economic rivalry and despite the fact that at different times the US and the EU have seen major challenges differently. But nonetheless, throughout the EU's history, the US has been a strong supporter of this. Now, despite this track record, which is quite a remarkable one, senior figures in the EU institutions and in the member states have recently taken to wonder out loud whether the EU will survive at all. This is quite extraordinary and even one might feel preposterous. But let's take a few minutes to consider why it is that a question so fundamental as this should have been posed. I think people began to raise questions at the beginning of the 21st century for a number of reasons. The possibility, for example, 2 years ago, that Greece might exit the euro, and today the fact that the Brits have decided to leave the European Union really set alarm bells ringing. Previously, the process of European integration was regarded as irreversible, and until the latest modification of the EU treaties in the Lisbon Treaty, there was no provision for a country to leave at all. But that has changed now, as we know, with the UK referendum of June 2016. More generally, and looking at it from a historical and a geopolitical perspective, I think doubts about the EU's sustainability arose from a number of changes. First of all, the end of the Cold War. I think there's no doubt in retrospect that the end of the Cold War removed a major external threat that had helped to provide the glue to hold Europe's disparate nations together. And although there are other threats today, without that very present threat from the Red Army that was 150 kilometers away from Frankfurt, the different nations of Europe have been more inclined to pursue their own conception of their national interests, to stress issues like sovereignty, rather than to be as firmly committed as they were previously to European integration. I think also following the collapse of communism and the end of the Cold War, there was a feeling of triumphalism in Europe. Our system had won. We had in some way won the Cold War. Some would even say that this triumphalism shaded into hubris. And because we felt that the wind was really in our sails, we pushed ahead with a number of bold initiatives for which perhaps the groundwork had not really been completed, and for which the national consensus in our different member states was not necessarily very strong. But we felt we could do it. We were the winners of the Cold War. All the former communist countries wanted to join us, and this was the time for us to deepen the process of integration as well as enlarging. So the introduction of a common currency, the euro, the calling at the start of the 21st century of a constitutional convention which was almost consciously modeled on the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention, as if we were on the brink of creating a kind of United States of Europe. The abolition of internal border controls within Europe through the Schengen system, and the idea embedded in the Lisbon Treaty that the EU would take on responsibility not just for economic integration, but also for security, foreign policy, and even defense. This was an extremely ambitious vision of the future of the European Union. I'm not saying it was an inappropriate vision, but at the time, public opinion had not been prepared for this. And there grew a feeling that the EU had been involved in a kind of overreach, a bridge too far, taking initiatives that might each have their own justification, but which went beyond where a consensus of opinion in the member states was fully ready to go. And this, I think, was one of the factors, but only one of the factors, that prepared the way for a new round of politics in the member states, in which insurgent politicians in several countries thought they could challenge the mainstream political parties by whipping up public sentiment against the EU and against immigration. That was very much linked in people's minds with the EU because of the free movement of labor. And we saw the rise of what is perhaps inappropriately known as populism in a number of member states. The task of these populists was made easier by a number of the characteristics of the EU that we really have to acknowledge. One of the first of these was the general tendency of the EU to take major decisions in a top-down way. This was really from the very beginning, I think, the vision of wise men, wise people, who had a conception, whether the creation of the coal and steel community or the European defense community that failed, or the introduction of the euro, on which the public was really not consulted. And the assumption was that these innovations would bring such strong benefits that the public would buy into them later on. This had generally worked in a period of economic growth and optimism, but in the conditions of the early 21st century, it didn't work so well. And on several occasions, the public was consulted, and referenda were held. And it was a real shock to see, for example, that in the referendum in Denmark on the Maastricht Treaty, the public said no. And then they were marched up and down the hill a couple of times, and then eventually they said yes. And in the case of the constitutional treaty that emerged from the extremely ambitious Constitutional Convention, referenda in two of the founding member states, in France and in Denmark, voted against the constitutional treaty. And then the constitutional treaty was remodeled without, as we say in England, the bells and whistles, without a European national anthem, without the other trappings of sovereignty to make it more acceptable, and then was later approved as the Lisbon Treaty without a second referendum. And I think this also opened the way for populists to charge that the EU was essentially undemocratic, and that these huge innovations were being imposed from the top without a proper democratic process. If, for example, on the euro, which was a huge development, a common currency is really a characteristic, usually of a sovereign state. But the euro was introduced, for example, without asking public opinion in Germany if they were in favor or not. And people knew perfectly well that if there had been a referendum in Germany in which the people were asked, do you wish to give up the Deutschmark and to replace it by a new currency to be called the euro, there is no doubt whatsoever what the reply of the German people would have been. And therefore, they were simply not asked. So I think doubts and uncertainties about the democratic foundation of the EU, partly influenced by this top-down approach, and then deepened by the global financial crisis, which led to very high levels of unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, and increasingly precarious jobs in countries that were pretty much used to lifetime employment as the model. Conflicts in the periphery of the EU to the east and to the south, particularly in Georgia, 2008, in Ukraine, and in North Africa and the Middle East, the Arab uprisings, and the fact that despite the EU's pretension to have a role in foreign and security policy, we had not been able to really prevent these new sources of instability from developing, or indeed to cope with their consequences. One of the leading European thinkers about the EU and related issues, Ivan Krastev, has written a book recently called After Europe. It's a very short book, and I would recommend the first chapter only. But in the first chapter, he treats migration as the factor that has to some extent replaced the class struggle as a main dividing line in European politics. And he thinks that various issues related to migration really have fed into this process of calling into question the European Union. We could come back to that in our Q&A if you wish. Globalization was also widely perceived by these insurgent politicians and sectors of public opinion as responsible for some of Europe's problems, either through the offshoring of jobs, known as delocalization in Europe, in French and beyond it, and also because of the large-scale migration that we faced. Now, these trends were quite general in different EU countries, but in Britain they took on a particular characteristic, with Eurosceptics depicting the EU in a way as the European manifestation of globalization, which threatened jobs and threatened national traditions. In her Florence speech last month, the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, said that the British have never been truly comfortable in the EU. There are many jokes about this that I won't repeat right now, and Wade has a terrific set of cartoons which depict this in one way or another. But I think there's something a little self-serving about attributing the Brexit phenomenon to the idea that the Brits have never been fully comfortable in the EU. This is only part of the story. It's one of the ironies of history that in reality, over the period since 1973, when the UK joined the European Union, Britain has really made its mark on the EU. I wrote an article a year or so ago, which I called, again, a little provocatively, the EU Made in Britain, in which I just indicated how many of the main policies and innovations of the EU were proposed by the UK, starting, ironically enough, with the single market, in which goods and services and capital and workers circulate freely. This was, to a considerable extent, the work of Margaret Thatcher, former British Prime Minister, and the man she sent to Brussels as the British Commissioner at the time, Arthur Cofield, who, working together with the then Commission President, Jacques Delors, had an extremely ambitious program of 200 pieces of legislation abolishing restrictions to free movement of different kinds within the internal market. So the single market is, if anything, a British creation. And if you were to ask the average French EU observer what they think about all of this, they will actually say that the single market is a sign of Britain's ultra-liberalism and the fact that the Brits have not been so concerned about social policy, but above all by a liberal theory of economics that points to abolishing obstacles. So it is a deep irony that the British Prime Minister and government today are determined to take Britain out of the single market once we leave the EU, even though this was par excellence a British creation. Other areas today of EU policy that were really introduced as a result of Britain joining the European Union, our whole policy on development assistance, the succession of conventions to provide assistance to African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, many of them former British colonies. This was really a British initiative, and it's one of the hallmarks of the EU that we're most proud of. Trade policy, a liberal trade policy, negotiating FTAs with countries around the world and working through several WTO rounds to liberalize international trade. The policy supporting struggling regions, post-industrial regions, Rust Belt regions, was introduced mainly after the Brits joined, because in the northeast of the UK we had such regions, and we wanted EU policies to regenerate these regions. I worked for 3 years, strangely enough, in fisheries policy. After 200-mile zones were created, exclusive economic zones, the EU became the manager of a 200-mile fisheries zone. And after many years in which our fish stocks were depleted, finally in the North Sea, the main stocks of cod and herring and other have come back. And this was largely through EU policies that were really influenced by the UK. You could point to a whole range of other areas. So it's extremely ironic and painful to me, I must say, today, that an institution that bears such a strong British mark, as well as the mark of the other countries, should now be held to some extent in contempt by a significant sector of opinion in the country, as I would say, that I used to know best. You know, there's a tradition in Brussels when you're an EU official or a commissioner, you have to take an oath of office that you will never seek or follow instructions from any member state, because you're supposed to act in the overall European interest. So in Brussels speak, the way people talk about their own country, which they're not supposed to represent, they say, the country I know best. So I'm afraid I'm saying these days about the UK, the country I used to know best, because it's really taken another path. Successive British prime ministers, unfortunately, have failed to get across to the British public the degree to which the EU favors British interests and actually bears a British mark. It was always so much easier for David Cameron or another prime minister to return from a European Council meeting in Brussels claiming victory. We had managed to prevail over these dastardly foreigners and get our interests through, and we triumphed. Or else we were tricked and we were taken in by the foreigners, rather than focus attention on domestic issues or areas where the government was struggling to get its own policies adopted, rather to blame the EU. And then all of a sudden, David Cameron turned round when he had promised a referendum and told the British people that it was an essential British interest to remain in the EU. And having heard these negative stories about Brussels for so long, it was very difficult for them to swallow that the British Prime Minister was now saying that to remain inside on the basis of a very minor series of concessions that he'd negotiated was an essential national interest. And I think the view of Mrs. May expressed in her Florence speech, that because the Brits were never comfortable with the EU, Brexit was almost inevitable, really disguises a major cause of Brexit, which is failings of leadership. And in the first instance, it was David Cameron, who seriously misjudged the situation in proposing a referendum as part of his government's program for the penultimate British election. And then to his surprise, he won the election, and he had a majority and had to implement this, which he didn't expect at all, and was done in a very ham-fisted way. And more recently, Theresa May, who replaced David Cameron after the referendum vote, and who immediately chose to interpret the referendum outcome, whereby a margin of 3.7% of the electorate, a tiny margin, there was a majority in favor of leaving the European Union. And she chose to interpret this to mean not only leaving the European Union, but also leaving the single market and leaving the customs union. Previously, when people had thought, what would life be like after Brexit? They thought it would be like Norway's relation with the EU or Switzerland's relations with the EU. In other words, very closely linked with the single market because of our economic interests, even if formally outside the EU. But she said, no, we're leaving everything. We're leaving the single market and the customs union. And she said that for the same reasons that had led David Cameron to call the referendum. They were both afraid of insurgent nationalist opposition, whether within the Conservative Party or from the United Kingdom Independence Party that was to the right of the Conservatives, opposed to immigration and opposed to the EU. And rather than show real leadership in standing up to these insurgent politicians, both of these prime ministers threw them red meat. And as they say in French, the appetite comes with the eating. So instead of appeasing them and getting them on board, that led them to up their demands. And I think that is pretty much what got us into the situation that we're in today. So to finish up, I want to give you a sense of two possible directions that the Brexit negotiations might lead to. By the way, we're doing a really interesting simulation that Wade has set up and that we're working together on with the students who are studying with Wade, a simulation of the Brexit negotiations here at BYU this week. And I must say, so far, my impression has been far more encouraging and positive from the exercise here than from the real negotiations. But let's see where we go. Anyway, at the cost of some simplification, I would give you two scenarios for how all of this might work out. The first scenario, taking a term that was used by Theresa May in her Florence speech last month, I will call a smooth and sensible Brexit, which is what she said that she wanted. So this first scenario looks like this. The two sides, the EU side and the UK side, who are involved in negotiations this week, there's a fifth round of such negotiations, reach an agreement on the main elements of the divorce settlement, the separation agreement, by the end of this year. This is the optimistic scenario, okay? And having reached agreement on the topics we're looking at in our simulation this week, which is mainly how much money the UK has to pay the EU for its existing commitments as part of its separation. There's the financial settlement. There's citizens' rights, the rights of Brits living in other EU countries after we've left, and the right of the 3 million or so Europeans from other member states living in the UK after we've left. So an agreement is reached on that. An agreement is reached also on maintaining the common travel area between the UK and Ireland and avoiding a hard border across the island of Ireland, because this was a key part of the Good Friday Agreement that brought to an end the Troubles in Ireland. And there's a general agreement that if there was a new hard border across Ireland, the men of violence might return, or in any event, the basis for the Good Friday Agreement could be called into question. So the positive scenario is that we reach we make enough progress by the end of this year on these separation issues for the heads of government of the EU meeting in the European Council to say sufficient progress has been made. Now we can talk about the future relationship between the UK and the EU after Britain leaves. There are then negotiations in the course of next year between January and October, which is more or less the EU's cut-off date for these negotiations, given the need for ratification subsequently by the European Parliament especially. And by October next year, we have not only the separation agreement, but we also have an agreement on the outline of the future relationship. And we have agreement on the transitional arrangements, which will take us from where we are today to the future partnership. This future partnership will have two parts. This is the optimistic scenario. The first part is an economic agreement covering trade, investment, and regulatory issues. So this will mean that there will be a means will be found to avoid obstacles to trade between Britain and the EU through an economic agreement. And then there will be a much more ambitious and wide-ranging parallel agreement, which the British Prime Minister has referred to as a deep and special partnership. And this will cover security, defense, counter-terrorism, counter-cyber war, police, judicial cooperation. It will mean that the kind of cooperation that takes place now within the EU will continue to take place after we leave. Now, because it will take time to negotiate these two agreements, a trade agreement, for example, the economic agreement that I've mentioned, based on recent examples like the agreement between the EU and Canada, could take up to 7 years to negotiate and then to ratify, although it could be brought into provisional application on the trade aspect sooner. And then this very ambitious, deep and special partnership would take years to conclude as well. So the Brits have said, we want then the British government, the British Prime Minister, a transitional arrangement to take us from here to there. So for 2 to 3 years, it would be agreed the EU's existing laws and rules, the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, would continue to function after Britain has left for the UK. We would continue to make contributions to the EU budget and to accept the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. This is asking a lot, by the way. So then, on this basis, on the basis of a separation agreement dealing mainly with those three areas, a transitional arrangement, and a broad vision of the future partnership that still needs to be negotiated, Britain leaves the EU at midnight on between the 29th of March and the 30th of March 2019. After that, life goes on much as before because of the standstill, the transitional arrangement, and a few years go by to conclude and bring into force these new agreements. I won't go into that in any more detail. We could come back to it if you wish in the questions. But broadly speaking, this is the smooth and sensible scenario. It's not a prediction. It doesn't mean I think it's going to happen. But it is a kind of depiction of what it would consist of. In practice, many of the details would differ from this, and there's many a slip along the way, as we know only too well. If I'd been here 2 weeks ago, I would have said that the smooth and sensible scenario is the central hypothesis, which describes in all probability what the future will look like. Today, I am much less certain, because some of the necessary conditions for this smooth and sensible scenario seem to be missing. One is a clear vision by the British government of the solution that they want to reach, their vision for the future. Another is unity on the part of the British government in pursuit of these objectives, whereas in reality, different ministers are taking radically different views and undermining the negotiations. The vision that the British chief negotiator, David Davis, who in our simulation is actually Wade Jacoby, has the whole backing of the government behind him. Also, a reasonable amount of flexibility on the EU side, which I think some of us feel is lacking. You could also imagine something else that would undermine the smooth and sensible hypothesis. The Prime Minister could be overthrown in a palace coup. All it takes is 35 members of the Parliamentary Conservative Party to call for a leadership contest, and she's out. And the new Prime Minister might have quite different views, particularly if that new Prime Minister was called Boris Johnson, for example. Or there could be an early general election, and the Labour Party could come to power. If there was an election tomorrow, they would win, probably. So any number of things could happen. Anyway, if the conditions for the smooth and sensible scenario are not realized, my second scenario is called the cliff edge scenario. And very briefly, it looks like this. Insufficient progress is made between now and December on the divorce settlement, for the European Council in December to say, now we're ready to talk about the future partnership, and now we're ready to talk about a transition period. Just yesterday, in a leak from the team negotiating on behalf of the EU, it was said that there is now serious doubt on the EU side as to whether sufficient progress will be made even by December. And that if it's not reached by December, the EU negotiator, Michel Barnier, former French minister, played by me in our simulation, has taken the view that there wouldn't be enough time then to conclude the negotiations before Britain leaves. So we would fail to agree on these three main topics by September. The British government would reject the financial settlement, considering it's unreasonable, Boris Johnson has said they can go whistle for their money. The Brits may propose a system of migration controls unacceptable to the EU. These are reasons why we might fail. The British red line that after we leave the EU, we'll no longer accept the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice may be an insurmountable obstacle. And then the Brits may not even accept a transitional period where we would still have to apply EU rules and laws, because the more extreme Eurosceptics would say, why did we bother to leave if we still have to implement all these rules and laws, even for a transitional period? In other words, there are any number of reasons why we might not even reach the separation agreement. And in that case, negotiations would continue next year through to October, but may not reach a conclusion. At that point, there would be two options. Either, if sufficient encouraging signs were there, they might have recourse to an old Brussels ruse of stopping the clock, pretending that it's not yet midnight, the 29th of March, continuing the negotiations. That would require unanimity of all 28 member states, or 27 plus 1. Or, if there wasn't such unanimity, then Britain would simply leave at midnight with no agreement in place whatsoever. This is an increasing probability. I was in touch with friends in London this morning. They are afraid that this might happen. If this happens, then after midnight, suddenly, Britain would have to put into place makeshift border controls for goods, for people, at Dover, different ports in the UK, and also in Ireland. If there was a hard border created in Ireland, this would give a major boost to Irish nationalists. There are those who say the demands then for Irish unification on the part of Irish nationalists would be very strong. There'd be huge backups of trucks at the border, miles and miles long, because there wouldn't be proper means to process the goods. The UK would try to revert to the World Trade Organization rules for its trade with the EU itself and with countries around the world. But some of these countries, including the US, have already indicated they might not be ready to accept the EU's schedule of WTO commitments as the basis for the UK after it left. So it's not even 100% sure that Britain could then, in the event of a cliff edge, trade on this basis. Some WTO members, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, maybe the US, would claim injury at the WTO. Even this is not clear. So this is the cliff edge scenario in brief, and it cannot be written off, however distasteful and worrying it may be. The probability of this is now increasing, and the time period that we have left is reduced. Hopes that the EU side might become more flexible and more accommodating after the French and German elections have been disappointed. Mrs. Merkel will be tightly hemmed in by her coalition partners, and I doubt if they're going to be very much more flexible. Once the 27 have agreed on negotiating directives, they become like the proverbial oil tanker, very difficult to turn around. It takes a very, very long time. And anyway, recent speeches by the Commission President, Mr. Juncker, Mrs. Merkel, Mr. Macron, have showed that the EU is much more focused on consolidating European integration than it is on the Brexit question, which is a less existential question for the other member states than it is for the UK. In any event, Brexit, on whatever scenario, is going to have very severe consequences for the EU, which I'm happy to discuss with you during the Q&A, which now I'm afraid is a little shorter than I'd otherwise foresee. Thank you.
We do have just a few minutes for questions. We ask for the benefit of those that are listening elsewhere that you come to the microphone here on this side. And if you're a BYU student, please identify yourself. Tell us your name and what you're studying.
Hi, I'm Peter Abernathy. I'm a double major in geospatial intelligence and history. And the question that I have is you're mentioning of how the EU made a lot of very ambitious moves in what we might consider a time of sort of relative geopolitical calm. So my question then is, as the world gets more and more complex, how do you foresee the EU becoming more adaptable for these types of issues? Because it seems to me that things are moving rather slowly. How can they adapt to a rapidly changing environment as far as refugee issues are concerned, or Britain leaving the EU? How can they change to that environment?
Very good question. Thank you. I think in each of these areas, academics, observers, diplomats can probably see what the right approach would be. You mentioned migration. So if we wish to maintain our system of open travel within the EU, clearly we have to have proper external border controls. We also need to revise our refugee and asylum policy. So for each of the major areas of challenge, we could see in the abstract where we should go. The problem is building a consensus among 27 states to move in that direction. I think what makes all the difference is political leadership. And if the member states are serious about all of this, they really need to send to Brussels commissioners, commission president, members of the European Parliament of really top caliber. One of the problems until now has been that the member states talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. They say they are committed to initiatives in all these fields, but then when it comes to practice, they are much more sensitive to national concerns than they are to making progress at the European level. The hope is that they'll be, in a way, sufficiently jolted by seeing Britain leave. Britain, the fifth largest economy in the world, one of the two member states with nuclear weapons, with power projection around the world, the second largest economy in the EU, that this will shake them up and enable them to take steps which in the past have been too difficult. But don't hold your breath.
Hi, I'm Louisa Paulson. I'm studying political science here at BYU. My question is in lieu with this, and one of your last points of European integration. My question is whether the EU are thinking beyond Brexit and how they're talking about European integration. Is it a train that you can't stop? Should it be stopped? Is Brexit an example of a consequence of this integration? So since we just focused so much on Brexit, I'm interested to hear what the general sentiment is of the EU about where to take the EU from now.
Thank you for that question, Louise. It's very pertinent. Because nobody knows the answer to your question, a popular approach that I was discussing yesterday with Wade is, about scenarios. And the scenario that the Commission would follow, that the believers in European federalism would follow, is that now, without Britain, the EU has an opportunity and a necessity to consolidate and strengthen the integration process. And the Commission has published proposals across a wide range of fields which would strengthen the process of integration. All the more necessary with Britain leaving, that in the area of energy policy, for example, we would really have a single energy market. We would diversify energy sources. We'd make real progress on the euro. There'd be a new understanding between France and Germany about eurozone governance. The rules might be relaxed so there would be less imposition of austerity on countries in the south of Europe with perhaps weaker economies. The Germans would start to stimulate consumption more domestically and reduce the imbalances. I mean, there are any number of specific steps that would be taken for a scenario of consolidation and strengthening integration. The other scenario, which underlies statements of politicians talking about the risk of collapse, is that the EU does not take those steps, that national considerations continue to predominate, that the Germans, for example, are unwilling really to go for any type of debt mutualization, to share the debt with the poorer countries, that the French are unable to implement serious reforms, that the EU does not collapse, but it continues at a lower level of activity. We lose something of the dynamic of European integration, and it begins to fray at the edges. So I don't know which course will be followed, probably something in between those two. But the other member states do realize, I think, that with Britain leaving, it really is necessary to consolidate the process of integration among those states remaining.
Hi, I'm Adriana Carter. I'm majoring in international relations. And my question is whether, amid the increasing tensions between the European Commission and member states, such as with Poland over the rule of law, migration, and the currency integration, do you think that the fears of a domino effect will become reality?
Thanks for that question. If you mean, do you mean by a domino effect, for example, what's happening in Britain would spread to other countries?
Yeah.
Or? I think that was a leading concern immediately after the referendum in June 2016. There was a fear of contagion, especially given the populist parties, the fact that Marine Le Pen in France, for example, had called for France to leave the euro, the fact that Greece might be kicked out of the euro, which no longer seems to be a risk. There was a feeling of contagion. Today, that feeling is less strong. Today, the feeling is that people have seen the mess that Britain has got itself into and the absence of a clear model for the future, and they are scared. And perhaps one of the reasons why Emmanuel Macron did so well against Marine Le Pen in the French parliamentary election was that she had made the mistake of calling for France to leave the euro and possibly the EU. And that scared the French people, seeing what the Brits had done to shoot themselves in the foot. So I think today the risk of contagion is less than it was before. I don't think there's any public opinion in any other member state where a majority is in favor of leaving the EU. But there is simmering anti-EU sentiment voiced by these populist parties like AfD in Germany, that 12.5% or whatever, they did really well, much better than had ever been expected previously. So the problem is there, even if it doesn't look like leading to another country seeking to leave the EU in the immediate future.
Hi, my name's Emmanuel Rialts. I'm studying international relations. My question is kind of double. So you talked a lot about the failing leadership, especially of the conservative leaders, both Prime Minister Cameron and Prime Minister May. You talked about how if there were general elections, sudden general elections, and the Labour Party came, that could change a lot of things. My first question is, does the Labour Party have members that are Eurosceptic, just like the Conservative Party has had to manage? And the second question is, if the Labour Party came to power during the Brexit situation, what would they do? Can they reverse, or what would be the scenario?
Thanks very much. I can see, as I said at the beginning, you're following the situation very closely and you're very well informed. It is a real possibility that the Labour Party would come to power in the next general election. It's not due till 2022, but it might occur earlier if the government were to collapse or lose a vote of confidence in the House of Commons. So it might happen. What would be the real implications of that? The fact is that some 2/3 of the MPs of the Labour Party are probably in favour of Remain. And probably a majority of Labour Party members, well, maybe not today a majority, but a large number of Labour Party members would also be in favour of remaining in the EU, and therefore might even be open to the notion of a second referendum. However, that is not the position of the party leadership. The leader of the party, Jeremy Corbyn, is a kind of closet leaver, has never said that he was really in favour of leaving. He didn't dare do that because 2/3 of his MPs were in favour of remaining. But he basically sees the EU as a capitalist plot and is against it. Since he became leader of the party, the membership of the Labour Party has more than doubled. They now have going on 600,000 members, compared, for example, with only 100,000 members in the Conservative Party. The Labour Party now has the largest membership of any political party in Western Europe. And these people have come into the party during Jeremy Corbyn's period and very largely are supportive of his position. So if there were to be tomorrow or next month or next year a Labour government, what would its position be? Probably time would be too short before 29th of March 2019 to reverse the policy entirely. And Jeremy Corbyn wouldn't try and do that. What some leading members of the party have said is they might be in favour, after Brexit, of remaining not just for a transitional period, but also permanently inside the customs union and the single market. So perhaps, but nobody knows, the main consequence of the Labour Party coming to power would be not to reverse the Brexit process, but to mean that the model for Britain's future relations with the EU would be more like the Norway model than the Canada model. The Canada model would treat Britain just as a third country, like Japan or the United States, and therefore conclude a free trade agreement. The Norway model is that Norway is really integrated into the single market, has a stake in the single market. In Norway's case, it's also part of Schengen. Britain is not. But still, if Labour came to power, there'd be a much better chance of Britain staying in the single market and the customs union, and therefore the disruption of supply chains, the problem about the border in Ireland, that would disappear. But anybody who tries to predict at this stage, especially about the future, is wrong. And I was at a round table the other day in Europe where one of the speakers from Germany said the best thing to do is to make your best possible prediction and then go to your bookmaker and bet against it, because we just don't know.
All right, that's all the time we have now. Please join me in thanking Sir Michael Leigh.
Pleasure.